My name is Amanda Winchell. I am the National Sales Manager for Library Analytics, and we're happy to be here today as a panel to really discuss, how you can use data to find your library's biggest advocates. So to just do a couple of introductions here, David, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. I'm David Zembeck. I'm a Senior Director for the public market for Gale. Been with the company now for close to 10 years and have worked very closely creating and implementing our analytics programs throughout the country.
Wonderful. And Lisa?
Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Novohatsky. I'm the Marketing and Analytics Consultant here at Gale. I work with users of Gale Analytics as well as Gale Engage to kind of just help facilitate conversations and to interpret the data and understand its implications.
Wonderful. And so basically, as I had mentioned previously, we're going to just discuss today how to find your library's biggest advocates, and I'm going to hand this off to David as our moderator.
All right, thank you very much, Amanda. So, this, I think, best place to start here with a sort of larger foundational question is, how can a library use data to build advocacy in its community?
So I think that every library has to start with the fundamentals, right? You need to establish a baseline to kind of understand your current situation. And then from there, you can prioritize services and offerings accordingly, and then strategize for next steps. So really, you can start by getting to know your community as a whole, both patrons and non-patrons. Many people in the community might be library advocates, but they may not necessarily be library users or active library users. So it's really important to include everyone. You can start with demographic data, get a really good community profile, understand what's going on, dig a little bit deeper, start to understand behaviors and interests, get a good sense of the community's needs. I think all libraries also should be leveraging usage data. A lot of the systems have data outputs that allow you to examine the usage of different services. If you analyze that data, it can really help you understand how patrons are engaging with the library and utilizing those different services. So I think with all, oh, go ahead.
And Lisa, you mentioned that when you're understanding the community and you're looking for advocates, we're talking patrons and non-patrons too. That seems a little counterintuitive, right? If a person is an advocate, how could they possibly, why would they be a non-patron? But I suppose people fall into those buckets all the time.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think that there are definitely people who support the library and who very much value the library services, but for different reasons and different circumstances, don't necessarily use the library for those services.
Okay, that's interesting. So with that, which is a nice jumping off point, the question becomes the data itself and the data that you just described. How readily available is this data to be able to do this type of programming or this type of introspection? How available is it to libraries, and if so, where they're likely to find it?
So most libraries are leveraging demographic data that's publicly available. So that would be data from the census or the American Community Survey. A lot of libraries are also working with their local municipalities, and they obtain data for a shared service area. So that could be things like custom geographic spatial files, that could be other demographics that are calculated, that could be community data. I know in some states and municipalities, there's also voter data that's publicly available. So voter data would be things like the voter information, as well as information on which members of the community have voted in previous elections. I know there's also one other common source, which isn't necessarily publicly available, but is becoming more common. A lot of libraries have partnerships with local school districts. So the libraries will provide services and library cards for students and teachers, and in return, they'll often get student outcomes data that they can then use for advocacy purposes.
Okay. And when we're talking about cost here, I mean, some of this that you mentioned before, voter data, that can either have a cost associated with it, a nominal cost, or perhaps it's free. But some of the census data, I'm assuming that a lot of this is readily available to people if they choose to look for it on the open web or on the census.gov site, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think most of the census data you can find, libraries will often string together census tracts or block groups to be able to make up their service area or service areas of individual branches. But there's definitely a lot of different ways you can access that data for free.
Okay. And of course, you got to know how to tap into the own data that you have internally too, which is another story, right?
Right.
That's there. We'll probably cover that. So thanks, Lisa. So Amanda, Lisa specifically mentioned patron data being an important role in analysis for building library support. Clearly, it's a list of your customers, right? The people that are using the services that you offer. And as I was looking into the conference and reviewing this recent OCLC awareness of funding study, I highlighted the statement that said that non-users of the library were just as likely as users to vote for libraries, which I found interesting. So obviously a library cannot only rely on patron data to access people that might support an initiative, but they must also focus on the non-patron data. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. So, I mean, just focusing on patron data is really only going to get us so far. So in other words, you could say, you know, if we're not communicating with our non-patrons, then we're missing half of our supporters out there. So the key is to really be able to communicate with your patrons and your non-patrons. But a lot of times the non-patron data isn't so accessible, you know, like some of that information that Lisa was talking about earlier. So I'm just going to show you a quick screenshot here, or share my screen to show you exactly what is available out there. Can you see this, David?
I can, yes. Yeah. What are we looking at?
Okay, super. So what we're taking a look at here is basically just a Tableau workbook. And the red dots here are the non-patrons, the blue dots are the patrons, and all of this colorful background is really a race and ethnicity data layer. That's going to go beyond the scope of this demonstration right now. But because we're specifically referencing non-patrons right now, I'm going to do a filter for that. And so when we are looking at our non-patrons, we can do a couple of things when we have access to this data. Number one, we can actually send out a mailer to the non-patrons. The other thing that we can do as well is we can take a look at the densely populated areas on this map that you can hopefully follow along with my mouse here. So right along in here, down here. And so if we target those densely populated areas, we can contact businesses, put out flyers, set them up in community centers, Starbucks, whatever it might be. But then that would be another way to get the message out to the non-patrons that are out there. Because remember, these are also our supporters. We can't just rely on our users. So that's one way that we want to take a look at this non-patron information, is to actually understand where they're located on a map and understand how we can reach them. The other thing that we can also take a look at here is more demographic information for the non-patrons. And so I'm just flipping to our non-patron measures tab in that same workbook. And on the right-hand side of the screen here, what you're taking a look at is the mosaic description. So this is a segmentation model. And so when I'm specifically looking at my non-patrons, I want to take a look at which segments make up most of my non-patrons in my community. For these that are mentioned right here, philanthropic sophisticates, sophisticated city dwellers, consummate consumers, I can actually drill down into this and get an understanding of really what makes up these segments. What are the demographic profiles of these segments? And it's going to help me to craft a marketing message so that I can base my communication on their particular interests, and then hopefully connect them to the library, or at least help them see the benefits and the value that the library offers out there. So that's one thing that I can do to be able to craft a marketing message to reach them. The other thing that's important to take a look at is some other demographic pieces of information that you can see here on the right-hand side. Estimated household income, just to kind of get an understanding of who these non-patrons are. Also presence of children. In this particular example here, and of course this is a fictitious, library service area here, it shows that most of these households don't have children. So obviously this impacts how it is that we communicate with them. And likewise, length of residence. Obviously, we want to reach out to individuals that are new within the community, so we start establishing those habits and bring them into the library. So these are just a few things that we can do. That number one, when we have access to that non-patron data, we know where they're located, we can reach out to them, and we can target message them based upon their interests. Because keep in mind, our messaging isn't just necessarily about converting a non-patron to a patron, but we want to communicate to those non-patrons to let them know the value that the library brings, so that when it comes time to vote, they can vote in our favor, even though they may not be a patron. So to kind of go back and answer your question, absolutely, patrons or non-patrons are as important as patrons when we're doing our communication.
Yeah, this has been very interesting. And again, this really does parallel, I think, how some political organizations might actually target voters as well too, right? I think it closely parallels the type of data modeling that they do. When you receive a mailer at your house, oftentimes there's some types of pieces of data or demographic information that someone has accumulated and is making a bet that you'll be responsive to the message that you receive. And this is really no different, and libraries should certainly be able to leverage this if they can. That makes a lot of sense. The other statement that Amanda, the other statement that struck me in the previous study is that we don't really have a lot of good data on library supporters. And so if we had data that could create sort of standard profile of what a library supporter, a voter, or a donor might look like, then you'd be able to connect with them probably a little bit more, a bit better of a fashion, a model, right? An archetype of a person or people that would most likely support a library, either through voting support, donor support, or just using it. Is there any data out there that could help people identify these library supporters from a segmentation perspective?
Yeah, so certainly best case scenario would be that we would have like a database of, library supporters, right? Or at the very least, maybe a profile of what a library supporter looks like, but we don't have access to that data. And I think until we do, I think the second best scenario that we could come up with is using segmentation data. So what I would recommend that libraries do is find a segmentation tool or system out there that takes a look at plethora of data points that would include contributions, for example, like how individuals are donating to different organizations within the community, whether that be, the school or a library or, the community event or whatever it might be. So in this scenario, I'm just going to share my screen again real quickly and bring this up. Are you able to see this, David?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, super. So when we're talking about segmentation systems out there, there's a lot of different data or variables that are taken into consideration. So if I'm going to want to isolate or try to figure out profiles of households or individuals that would have a propensity to donate to the library or be library supporters, I would want to take a look at those that contribute to charities, arts or cultural charities, education charities, some of these ones that you can see here that I've highlighted. The segmentation that you're seeing here is the Experian Mosaic segmentation model, and they have about 700 or so different data points that we can actually drill down into. So I am taking a look at the how we view the world category and then really drill down into contributions. So when I do that and I can click on any of these variables here, what actually comes up and what it actually tells me is that this particular segment, A5, couples with clout here, is one that has a very, very high propensity to donate to educational charities. Now, again, you can, factor in any of the other variables that I had mentioned previously, but this happens to be one of the highest. So what it gives us here is a nice snapshot of really who these people are. So we've got key features here on the left-hand side. They're affluent, highly educated, etc. We have a decent idea of, their age, how many people are in the household, their income. And then on the right-hand side, we can take a look at their channel preferences. So these numbers here are indices. That's giving us an idea of how likely they would be to respond to these various marketing channels. So with TV, They would definitely respond to email, pretty similar. Radio, not so much, because this is less than 100. SMS marketing, yes. Email for sure. Social media, yeah, right around there in average. So the segmentation tool has different models that you can use or you can look at to really craft those marketing messages.
So,
Go ahead.
So are you saying, Amanda, that one might be able to use segmentation by first off identifying those people in the community or in the service area that align with specific segmentation types? You'll be able to dive in to learn a little bit more about why you might want to market or reach out to these people, but also the mechanisms or the way that which you're likely to have better success in reaching these people outside of applying the same type of outreach for everyone. Some might respond to email a bit more, some might respond to social media, some might respond to direct mail. It's all different based on a different segment.
Right. So it's really, I would take into consideration a couple of things. Number one, you need to identify the variable, like the contribution, for example, that will help you to understand the segment that's going to have a propensity to donate to the library. That's number one, right? And then you need to, so once you identify your audience, then you need to know the channel or how to reach out to them, whether that be via email or social media or, direct mail, like you had mentioned. And so you want to have a tool available to you at your fingertips that's going to be able to guide you in those kind of decisions.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense.
And hard to do all that without data.
Very difficult
impossible.
to do.
Impossible, I might say. Yeah.
Yes, very difficult to do without data. Any other questions in that area, David?
Oh, yeah. So we're looking at here. So not only do you have the ability to reach out perhaps based on segmentation type or propensity to donate, right? If that's the variable what we're looking at, but certainly behaviors, right? That are maybe library adjacent perhaps that we're seeing here.
Right. So the whole point in this, screen share here was that this is specific to that couples with clout. So if you were going to reach out to this particular segment, then you would want to get an idea of who they are, what they like, what their preferences are, what their interests are. And if you understand what their interests are, then you can craft that marketing message that would appeal to them. Because obviously we're in the day and age now of target marketing, right? You don't just slap the exact same message to everybody out there. You want to send something that's going to appeal to them, that's going to prompt them to open that email or open up that direct mail or open up that message. And if something doesn't trigger them right away, what are they going to do? Unsubscribe, delete, that sort of thing. So this tool is going to help them to be able to target that messaging.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Amanda. That's great. So Lisa, question for you. So, Amanda sort of went through the basics on segmentation, how one might use it, but how would a library go about using this information to gain potential support? How could they act on that based on what Amanda just shared with us?
That's a great question. So I think between Gale Analytics and the Experian information, you're really armed to start with some targeted outreach. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can take a look at the Gale Analytics dashboard. It's going to be very similar to what we saw with Amanda earlier. Can you see my screen there? Okay. So what we're looking at here is we're looking at the Gale Analytics dashboard. And as Amanda said, this is a fake library that we use just for demonstration purposes. We call it the Gale Public Library. With the red dots, you see non-patrons, and with the blue dots, you see patrons. And so in starting to think about different things we could do, we can start to use the maps to understand how you want to prioritize in-person outreach. We can use Amanda's example. So I'm going to use the mosaic description filter on the right to say, show me where the couples with clout are. And then we can start to talk about different ways you can strategize in-person outreach using these maps and using this information. So now what we see couples with clout are the only households that are left, both patrons and non-patrons. You see both red and blue dots. On the bottom left-hand side, you'll see the running count. So this includes 266 households, again, both patrons and non-patrons. Now, seeing this information, you can start to think of a couple different ways to use it. One strategy would be to think about an area where there's a high density of non-patrons and a low density of patrons. That way, prioritizing that area for in-person outreach would really give you a big bang for your buck. right? You get a lot of exposure to a number of people who you don't already have a relationship with, and who maybe you'd like to have a conversation with to talk about some of the things the library's been doing, some of the things they might be interested in. Now, using this interactive map, we can learn a lot about what's going on in these areas. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a little bit here, and we start to see a few things come into play. So we see the Oakland Community College, we see an Islamic Cultural Association. Scrolling up a little bit, you see Pioneer Park, North Farmington High School, Forest School. You know, what we're really doing here is we're exploring the area to understand where you might want to prioritize doing in-person outreach. You might want to consider partnering with an organization like a school or a cultural association. That way you can talk to some of the members of the community that frequent those establishments or are part of smaller communities within the community. You can look for things like parks or farmers markets or transportation hubs. You know, look for things that have high foot traffic, places where you can reach a lot of people and get a chance to talk to a number of people you may not have had a chance to talk to before. We also have a mailing list feature, which I'll switch to now. We have a mailing list tab here. And the mailing list is exactly what it sounds like. You know, we create different lists of addresses, that's physical address as well as email address, that allows you to start doing some targeted marketing. So you'll see on the right, we have the mosaic description that's selected. That filter has persisted. So this is just the couples with cloud households. Again, both patrons and non-patrons. The number is 266 total. And what we have is we have a really nice clean list of addresses if you wanted to do some kind of a mailer campaign, which is a really good way to get a message out into the community with a very central location, just kind of mailing it out. An email address field here as well. Now, the way the email address works is that when you generate the dashboard, you can include patron email addresses if that's a data point that you have within your ILS. And what we do is we attach that to the household, and then when we do our analysis here, we keep in that email address that you can create lists of email addresses for targeted campaigns as well. So we kind of give you that. It's a very easy process. You'll see on the top left, there's some instructions there. Really all you have to do is press a couple buttons, and this exports as a really nice clean CSV file that looks exactly like what we're looking at here. We do have one other dashboard, which is a totally separate dashboard. In the interest of time, I'm not going to show that today, but you can always reach out if you're interested. We have the voters dashboard, which can help you to analyze the patrons who have voted in previous elections. So what it does is it blends your patron data with the Experian data to get a little bit more information, and then it also blends your data with voter data. And that way we can look at some of the data that can be acquired from election boards, as David had said earlier, sometimes for a nominal fee, sometimes for free, depending on the state and municipality. And you can just better understand subsets of your patrons who have voted in past elections. You can explore their demographics, understand which mosaic segments are the most prominent and get to know those segments, and then see where they cluster in your service area using the interactive maps.
Oh, that's great. So Lisa, you know, we've mentioned targeted outreach several times now, and that could be either direct mail or email, perhaps. Can you talk just a little bit about the value of the targeted marketing today, particularly through the lens of library advocacy, if you would? Certainly, we know that attention spans have declined precipitously over the last 10 to 15 years. So anything targeted is preferred than not. But you can talk a little bit about that, if you would, the value of that.
Yeah, I know Amanda mentioned targeted outreach a little bit earlier too. I mean, targeted outreach is so valuable for so many reasons. There's so many organizations, some libraries included, that like to send blanket communications, and they send the same thing to all subscribers with little to no personalization. And in this day and age, you know, people expect personalization. I think that communications that are not immediately relevant are ignored, and unfortunately can lead to a permanent loss of interest and engagement. And you really want to make sure you keep that message relevant so you can keep that line of communication alive. I think more than anything, we want to make sure we avoid that unsubscribe, right? You want to make sure you can keep talking, keep raising awareness. I think targeted marketing also builds loyalty. You know, engaging the reader with relevant information and keeping them reading and looking for more is so important. And it leads to higher levels of engagement with your communications and a higher likelihood that your message will be heard and absorbed. You know, I think about email campaigns specifically, and I think one nice thing, you know, I'm a data analyst. I've been a data analyst for a long time, and what I love about email campaigns is that you can measure engagement. You know, there are statistics that are built in that allow you to measure engagement with different messages that can then help you optimize and to, you know, keep strategizing with your communications going forward. So I think about an example, like an email message around advocacy, right? So you send an email that talks about some of the things that you're doing, and then you can embed a link that says, click here to learn more, click here to learn how the library is supporting the community. And there are two different statistics you have there. So you can start thinking about an open rate, which is the first step of getting someone to read your email. And then you can look at the click-through rate to understand who took the further step, how many people were really engaging with the message you sent, and they were really interested. So I think there's a ton of value here, and I think targeted marketing is definitely something that all libraries should consider.
So Lisa, let me ask you a follow-up question here. This just sort of occurred to me here. What would you say to institutions like libraries that perhaps are not historically comfortable with emailing as much or connecting, in a more focused way with customers than they have in the past? Because we get that a lot, right? We attend conferences, we talk to a lot of different people in this industry, and the relative level of comfort with doing something like that is not there by and large. Would you say anything to that?
I mean, I think that there are kind of two ways to look at it. I mean, on the one hand, you're having people subscribe, right? So you have their email address that they provided to you, and they are saying, I'd like to get communications from the library. So really what you're doing is you're optimizing those communications by making sure that the message is the most relevant to them, so that it's something that they're interested in, something they may want to participate in. I think, on another note, but kind of the same thing, we're living in 2020 now, and especially now, we're in a Zoom conference, right? I mean, everything's digital, and people expect to have this level of service. And I think for the library to step up and provide the service that they might expect from an Amazon or a Target or a Costco, right? I think that would be extremely impressive. And I think that, peers, peer libraries would be really impressed. And I think that the users themselves would be impressed too, because they're starting to get the service that they're coming to expect from everybody else now.
Yeah, I think that's great. Yeah, thank you for that. It feels like the general population expects it, by the way, too, right? And when they don't get it, it's probably not interpreted as, well, at least I'm not being bothered. It's like, why don't I know this? Why am I not being told about this? Yeah, I think that's great. Thank you. So Amanda, all of this has been very helpful, I think, for me in understanding and discussing, what you can do with data. But again, the library's got a lot of disparate data sets, right, coming from a lot of different vendors. So realistically speaking, how could you take all of those into consideration if you're going to truly provide a focused marketing effort?
Yeah. So just to reiterate what Lisa said, I think now more than ever, target marketing is essential, particularly when we're talking about library advocacy and building support for the library and getting those votes that we need to continue funding and to improve funding as well. But I think you raised an important question as well, is that how do we really know these interests of our patrons, right? I mean, we've got overdrive data, we've got ILS data, we've got program data, we've got, door counts, we've got hundreds of data sets that are completely independent of one another. And right now we're just looking at them in silos, right? It's virtually impossible to combine them and look at them from a holistic standpoint. But that's where what we would call data centralization comes in. And so what that really does is it combines all those disparate data sets, processes them, and allows the library to look at how patrons are engaging with the library from a holistic standpoint. So we're no longer looking at these silos or being able or being forced to look at data independently, but we can see it from a holistic standpoint. And when we do that, I'm just going to share my screen again, if you don't mind, David.
I never mind screen sharing.
Okay, let's share here.
I shouldn't say never, but
never. Well,
not in this case.
There are limits. Okay, so what happens? There's several very positive side effects to data centralization. So when we centralize all of that data that I had just described, one of the things that we can do with it is we can start creating what we call these patron groups, and groups like what you see here on the screen. Maybe it's adult fiction, or somebody who only checks out books, or maybe it's just ebooks, or maybe they're DVDs, or maybe they're graphic novels or mystery or whatever it might be. But when we upload all of that and these categories can be automatically created, the patrons can then be funneled into multiple categories that apply to their interest. And so when we have them there, that's what will allow us to target market. And so all we really need to do is then use these groups to then build an email campaign. So let's say, for example, oh, you have a mystery author calling in to do, a Zoom program, right? And like Lisa was talking about, the last thing that we want to do is send that message to absolutely everybody out there who's never even shown any interest in mystery novels before. But what we can do is just target it and send it to those individuals that have mystery transactions, let's say within the last 6 months or whatever the library prefers. And now all of a sudden you're addressing their interests. You are communicating with them in a way that they're going to consider valuable. And so if you do this time and time again and repeatedly, that's what builds that loyalty that Lisa was talking about. And what is also avoiding is the patron pressing unsubscribe or just clicking delete and potentially missing something that they could have otherwise been interested in. So target marketing is a huge value to libraries nowadays and is possible through this means of data centralization, which I just described. Now, there's one other, I don't want to call it a side effect, but one other feature that really makes sense when libraries are centralizing their data in order to target market, and that gives them also the ability to build these visualizations or metrics. I know a lot of libraries today spend a lot of time, whether that be in Tableau or Power BI or Excel or whatever it might be, to build visualizations so that they can create graphics that will appeal to people, whether it be their board or stakeholders out there or other individuals within the organization, because most people aren't necessarily intrinsically data savvy, right? It's tough. So the key to that is to create these metrics or visualizations that can help people to easily interpret data. And when all that data is being centralized and visualizations such as you see on your screen right now are automatically being created, that is saving time for somebody else creating those, and then also saving time with training or interpretation, because it's a lot easier to interpret a graph or something colorful and easy on the eyes than an Excel file with millions of pieces of data on there. So going back to your question, David, is it possible, to target market when we've got all of these disparate data sets? Absolutely, and the answer to that is really through data centralization.
Okay, great. Thank you, Amanda. So Lisa and Amanda, in summary here, what do you think 3 things libraries can do with data right now that will support their fundraising and advocacy efforts?
Yeah, here's my other screen share. I'm bombarding you with my screen shares now, David.
That's quite all right.
I think, and Lisa had talked about this a little bit earlier, if you want to touch on this one, Lisa.
I'm gonna make there. Okay. I think one of the things that you really need to do first is to get to know your data. I mean, as Amanda said, there are so many data sources within the library, outside of the library. I mean, there's so many things that you can leverage to really be able to build really efficient and effective library advocacy campaigns. So I think the first is to get to know the data you have, and then the second is to get to know your patrons and non-patrons. Establish that baseline. Understand your current situation so you can understand where you want to go moving forward.
And I think that, the second one that I had touched on earlier was to really identify, locate, and reach out to your library advocates. And we can do this using that market segmentation model that I had described earlier. So number one, when you can identify not just your patrons, but also your non-patrons, and then you can be able to segment them and then cater a message based upon their interests, that is going to, again, build that loyalty that both Lisa and I had talked about earlier, and certainly allow you to to hopefully transform somebody into a library advocate. Even if they don't come to the library, they can obviously vote for you at the ballot. And then the third one, target market based on library behavior, right? I kind of touched on that a little bit. So if you want to expound on that at all, Lisa?
Yeah, I mean, I think we talked about that with the value of targeted marketing, right? People expect to have personalized communications now. And so what you can do is you can start to think about leveraging some of that data, understanding how people are engaging with the library, and use that information to understand who to target different messages to and what kind of content you want to curate for those messages. And then I talked a little bit about tracking the results, right? There are different ways that you can kind of track engagement with the library and continue to build that loyalty to the library.
So, three things kind of in a nutshell, David. Get to know your data, get to know your patrons and non-patrons, locate them, segment them, and reach out to them based upon their interests in order to build loyalty. I think all of those things really encompass or help us move toward, growing that library advocacy base.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's great. I totally agree. So, so thank you very much, Amanda and Lisa. To learn more for our visitors, please visit us at the URL above under gale.com, or join us for a live chat in the LAFCON experience on Wednesday, September 16th from 3 to 3:30 Eastern Time. With that said, thank you very much, Amanda and Lisa.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure to spend the time today, and I learned something today as well too. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
You all are fantastic. Seriously, that was great. I got to thank you for two things. One is the view. I haven't cracked open analytics myself in a little while. Patrick uses it over here, and I have to beat him up a little bit for not sharing the output screens with me. The way it builds across the match is really, just from a technical perspective, really useful. But then also your insights into how to put this to work, both for fundraising and for politics. You hit the nail exactly on the head for me. I couldn't ask for a more germane and appropriate kind of conversation. And what we'll be able to do on Wednesday next week is really put this to work for folks with a little bit more in conversation. What I want to be able to do with you is tee it up, again, share it in real time. And David, you've coined something that I don't know if you realize it or not, but you just gave me a new hook in the LAFCON experience. Well, I'll cue it up. We'll play it again, basically, and then we'll do some Q&A. And what we'll do with it, I think, given the length of it, is, I'll do like in the activity stream, we'll remind people to take a look at it, and then we'll be hosting our live Q&A. Our assumption will be that people have watched it, and then we'll just do our conversation with each other then during that half-hour time period. And then we'll assume that the people who haven't watched it will be jealous, and they'll go back and watch it later,
Oh, okay.
So this is a weird synchronous and asynchronous experience. So as long as we have a willing suspension of disbelief about it, I think it'll be very natural for us to do together,
Mm-hmm. That's good.
Great.
How many minutes was that, John?
I'm sorry, say again?
How many minutes was that?
Let me hit